What's up, folks? Welcome back to the Whoop Podcast, where we sit down with top athletes, scientists, experts, and more to learn what the best in the world are doing to perform at their peak, and of course, what you can do to unlock your own best performance. I'm your host, Will Ahmed, founder and CEO of Whoop, where we are on a mission to unlock human performance. That's right, you can get the Whoop membership, hardware, software, analytics, the new Whoop 4.0. It helps you understand and improve your health. Check that out with the code WILL, W-I-L-L, and you get 15% off a Whoop membership. This week, we're excited to welcome Dr. Robin Thorpe for an episode on the science of recovery. This is the second of a 3-episode series, which also includes the science of sleep and the science of strain, coming soon. The series is demystifying these core concepts, answering common questions, and debunking myths with some of the leading experts in the field. Dr. Thorpe is best known for his work with some of the world's best soccer players. He spent nearly 10 years with Manchester United as a senior performance scientist and conditioning coach. He's also helped world-class track and field athletes, Olympic gold medalists, and world record holders in the lead up to their biggest performances. And a lot of his work is balancing training loads with recovery. Robin sits down with our VP of Performance, Kristen Holmes, who you all know and love, to discuss the physiological and psychological benefits of recovery and really how you can get your body to perform at its peak. They discuss what metabolic fatigue and structural damage are and how that changes how you should think about recovery, different recovery modalities and how they affect your body, what you need to know about hot therapy and cold therapy, and why HRV is such an excellent measurement of recovery, both physical and mental. Without further ado, here are Kristen and Dr. Robin Thorpe.
Dr. Thorpe, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
I will say I distinctly remember the first time we spoke. I think I literally just first started working at Whoop, and I was actually pretty familiar with some of your research from my coaching days, specifically your work on muscle damage, endocrine and immune marker response to exercise, I believe, and just your reputation in the performance space generally. So I was actually really nervous for our call because I had this feeling like you were going to absolutely grill me. And you did. Just you asked me super, super in-depth questions on how we, calculate recovery and HRV and sleep validation. And it was awesome because I was like, wow, if I get to talk to folks like this every day, I'm just going to learn a ton. So it was a really cool first call kind of, and really made me appreciate the level of expertise, certainly that you had.
Yeah, that paper's taking me back. That was a few years ago, but
I know.
I'm glad I grilled you. That means I was doing my job correctly.
That's right. And that's what's, I think, so cool. You're a scientist, right? And it's your job to be skeptical. And, you're caring at the time. You were working for Manchester United, and your role was to help the players stay healthy and fit. So maybe we can start there. If you just want to talk a little bit about, what got you excited about recovery? Because it was really, you were a very early adopter. I mean, really, I don't know if this is 100% accurate, but the concept of recovery was very new. I think when we think about a decade and a half ago, and you were on the forefront kind of doing research and trying to figure out how to actually apply some of these recovery principles in an environment that's going 1,000 miles an hour that really isn't used to using recovery concepts and using recovery monitoring to kind of prescribe load. So maybe just talk about where you started and kind of how you began to socialize these concepts and your work at Man United.
Yeah, so you mentioned before that obviously I'm a performance scientist, but originally I was a coach and a performance strength and conditioning coach, but I think when it comes to applying the sort of scientific side and nature of things, I think I like to look at it that most decisions and how I work with athletes or other coaches and staff is that I try and apply some scientific rigor to sort of every decision and every framework that I try and lay out with those key stakeholders. But I think from how I sort of got into this space was, again, just being a sort of performance scientist and an S&C coach in the early days at Manchester United back in the sort of late sort of 2000s. It was always born. We had a great department at the time, and we were probably really one of the only sports science or performance science departments probably in the world at that point in elite sport. And it was simply the manager at the time, the head coach, Sir Alex Ferguson, who would ask the question whether or not the players were ready to train or play at the weekend. And of course, we were able to answer that with some level of confidence with the information that we had and the expertise within our department, but we never really knew to a real high level of confidence, like providing those answers and the solutions. So that sort of triggered me to undertake a PhD on the side of the role of a sports scientist with the players, and all the data that was collected through that PhD was with the first team players, and the aim was to try and better answer that coach-led question of, well, are those players ready to train or ready to play? So that started initially to understand, well, how can we understand if they need to recover at all or not? And I think that's a really important part, is that's probably, if anyone is looking to enhance recovery or figure out how they can recover more optimally, I think it's important to understand if you even need to or not in the first place. So that first part of monitoring, understanding more about how our fatigue levels or our recovery status, whatever we want to call it, our readiness, that was always going to be the first port of call. And then following that, and when we started to unwrap that massive area of recovery and the systems that are the subcomponents, then it was about, well, how can we best manage it and how can we best accelerate recovery with the potential recovery strategies that we have on offer or the athletes these days have available to them. And again, what's been done in the research as well. So I think that's how it all began at the beginning. And I think we did that in the right way, and I think we did it in a really solid manner through a PhD research process that was applied. And it was, again, that was one of the first applied PhDs at the highest level of professional sport in the world as well. So it was a great time to be involved with that and almost sort of pioneer that type of process.
And I think about, again, kind of how early you were, like this, even just this word recovery, wasn't ubiquitous across, the sporting landscape. So you kind of had to educate, coaches and players on what that actually means. And I know, because I know you and I know your work, I know that you are not into kind of injury prediction models necessarily, but if you can just talk about your framework, how you think about whether or not a player plays versus not, and how you deliver that feedback to the coach, for example.
Early, I think it starts with understanding the subcomponents of recovery. So if we take recovery as this single entity that the sort of world almost observes recovery within it, I think we need to definitely be critical of how we look at that, and we need to definitely understand what the subcomponents and those systems are and how they interact together. So I think the first thing we need to do is understand the demands of our sport or our exercise. If we're a weekend warrior, what are our demands of our general training regime? And then start to really unpick what are those physiological systems. And typically, there'll be a few things which are going to be out of our control in terms of environmental. There's also going to be an element of cognitive or psychological demand. But I think it all, generally speaking, boils down to two subcomponents of muscle fatigue. And I think that's going to be a metabolic fatigue pathway and then a structural damage fatigue pathway. And I think the neuromuscular system feeds into this as well. And the neuromuscular system can tax both elements of these two systems. And if we look at the metabolic fatigue pathway, we know that there's variations and changes in things like lactate acidosis, variations in potassium accumulation, glycogen depletion, a lot of these sort of oxidative stress, a lot of these typical metabolic stresses which are ongoing within the muscle cell and the body when we exercise. So there's that one arm to think about. And then the second arm is this structural damage, and that's most likely caused by a mechanical stress. So more like the sprint and the eccentric contractions. It may be a sport where you're accelerating and decelerating. Those types of movement patterns create this mechanical stress which can lead to structural damage. And of course, we know that there's other elements like a thermoregulatory interaction which can worsen these two systems of metabolic fatigue and also structural damage. But I think if we look at those two things in isolation, I think we get a better understanding of how we can then start to accelerate recovery with common recovery strategies that we all know that are available in the world today. But I think it's really important, and the key take home is to really try and understand that recovery is, there are subcomponents. We shouldn't look at it as a single entity system. And then we should try and then next level is figure out a way of how we can monitor whether an athlete, or whether it's yourself and you're that weekend warrior who runs for miles, or you're involved in any type of exercise, how can we understand ourselves, or how can we monitor ourselves to understand if we're in an element of metabolic fatigue or structural damage?
Outlining those origins of fatigue are really important. You mentioned the metabolic fatigue kind of symptoms of, and just if we think about mechanical stress, like that, symptoms would be what, inflammation, soreness, what are some other symptoms related to mechanical stress?
I mean, I think there was research even published last week that I think even after seconds and minutes, we have this inflammatory cascade that is infiltrated to the muscle cell following this mechanical stress. And like you say, there is the symptoms that we see are notably soreness. There could be some bleeding. There could be edema. There could be a lot of symptoms related to this inflammatory cascade, which again, it's similar. It was described to me once as like a pimple or a spot where there's a lot of redness. There's the oozing of fluid and things like that, and it's sore to the touch. So that's also similar to what happens when structural damage exists at the muscle cell. But we also see issues with potentially negative impact of the sleep and sort of more sub and later stage symptoms related to structural damage. But I think monitoring muscle soreness and how our muscles feel in terms of DOMS, etc., I think that gives us a really good indication of whether or not we're experiencing some sort of mechanical stress and structural damage.
Do we need to be sore in order to gain muscle?
Well, I mean, I think that boils down to the question is, well, I mean, I think number one, we've understood, or I'm trying to persuade the listener, right, we need to look at recovery in more than just one single entity. Let's look at the systems. But then I think the second question as well is, well, do we even need to recover? Is the stress of the exercise or whatever we've done, played a soccer match or a football match, whatever it may be, does that stress, is that large enough or potent enough to incur a stimulus which we need to recover from? Do we need to return to some level of homeostasis? Has it incurred that stress level? And there's so many factors that can influence that, and being highly trained, highly adapted, phase of the season. And like your question, well, do we need to be sore to build muscle? Well, I think we know that soreness doesn't directly correlate with adaptation. I think that's quite clear, because there's so many factors, from the response to load, the response to exercise and training, that changes how we adapt. But I think in times where we are looking to adapt from a strength perspective or a power perspective, we need to create a stimulus or enough of a stress response that we are going to elicit those adaptations. And I think some of those adaptations are related to the structural damage that we can create through mechanical stress. And so, yes, soreness is an indication that structural damage has occurred. So in some way, potentially the answer would be yes. But from a sort of finite perspective, soreness doesn't always equal positive adaptation.
And I think you mentioned maybe potentially a good definition of recovery is basically the body's return to homeostasis after stress. Would you say that that's kind of the best way to define recovery?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's quite difficult to give it a good definition, if I'm honest. I'm still probably looking for that answer. But I think a return, if there's a physiological stress which has taken the human body and the systems within that to a reduction or a negative influence of homeostasis, then our recovery process would be to return the body and those systems to that pre-level. And again, that could be from a psychological component. It could be from an environmental perspective. Muscle fatigue, neuromuscular fatigue. So I think there's a lot of subcomponents within that recovery umbrella that we certainly need to be mindful of.
Perfect. So just kind of going back to the symptoms, like how will the kind of mechanical and metabolic symptoms manifest in the biometric data? Kind of what have you seen in your practice of just measuring, all of this biometric data and subjective data? What do you kind of see bubble to the surface as being kind of most essential in kind of tracking?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's quite a broad question as well, because that was one of our first ways from our research, right? How can we understand the negative impact of exercise from football, from soccer, within some common metrics that we can actually assess in the environment? And I mean, the first thing is there's so many metrics out there that we can use, and there's so many products out there that we can use. And I think the research that we did, we've actually found that just asking valid, repeatable questions in questionnaire format to athletes was actually one of the most sensitive methods of understanding whether or not we had structural damage or metabolic fatigue. And the way we did that was effectively what we've already discussed. How sore do you feel?
Yeah.
So that question, again, if we do that in a very stringent manner and in a systematic way, because we can use statistical analyses around that to really heighten the sophistication of the tool, but that really gave an indication of whether or not there was some, effectively, the mechanical stress and structural damage.
Right.
And then we also asked whether or not the athletes were fatigued and how, and their level of sort of perceived fatigue. And that gave us an indication of some of the symptoms associated with metabolic stress, so heavy legs, being tired, a sense of lethargy, which all have small correlations with some of these metabolic pathways, whether it's acidosis, the changes in these protein ions, potassium, etc., or even glycogen levels. So even just asking simple questions or understanding from the individual, being really aware and conscious of how you feel at any given point in time, I think can give you those first, that gateway to understand recovery and to do something about it, to accelerate back to homeostasis like we've discussed. And I think from that level as the gateway, is using these questionnaire-based tools, I think we can then look to HRV, we can look to other heart rate-derived autonomic nervous system measures, resting heart rate. Is there a standardized exercise that we do regularly? Because if there is, we can also look at exercise and heart rate, peak heart rate, things like that. And of course, we have things like the use of more performance or neuromuscular type tests, like a lot of sports teams now use force platforms to measure the direct force that athletes can apply into the ground. That can give us an indication of neuromuscular fatigue related to the other elements of our two pathways of metabolic and structural fatigue damage. So I think there's a lot of ways we can do that. I think still the key thing is to do it in the correct way and in a systematic way. But for me, key point number two is start with real repeatable questionnaires.
We think about this in terms of, non-professional, sports and, even collegiate sports to a degree. And I certainly saw this in my data when I was coaching, my athletes' data, is that, in the absence of kind of hard physical exertion, sometimes the athletes still weren't ready, still didn't have the capacity, the perception that they could compete. And when you look at what's happening, in practice the previous day, you're like, well, there's no real reason this person should be tired and they shouldn't feel heavy legs, right? But can you just talk a little bit about the kind of emotional and mental component and how to think about recovery in those terms and what those signs might look like and how it might manifest in the data?
Really interesting point, because again, a lot of the work that I've done and what I've described over the last few minutes has been mainly around muscle fatigue.
Right.
But the cognitive, psychological component is huge. And I think the one great thing that we have is that we can measure HRV, which I think is probably the closest thing at the moment we have to measure some of those psychological or mental fatiguing properties. And I mean, that was one thing from a lot of my research, was the missing piece of the puzzle was this mental fatigue assessment measure. And we figured, we can understand about the metabolic side, structural damage, We know about the environmental side. We can measure some of the more anatomical, clinical, physiotherapy type things as well. But the one thing we were missing was that mental fatiguing aspect. But what we really did know was that measuring HRV, I think, does provide a strong element of the mental fatiguing aspect. So an example that I think is quite interesting is that when this was probably in 2016 actually, and we had a player, and in the UK and in the Premier League, notorious for the winter and the Christmas period where the whole of Europe gets 2 weeks off, and then the English Premier League just batter through. And not only they batter through, they play like 2 games in 2 days, which from a soccer perspective and the demands is a tough ordeal. And I mean, it was always quite good for me because it's like, right, this is where recovery comes in. I can earn my money here. But we had a player, and again, it's my belief that I don't think any Premier League player can play every game of the season.
Yeah. With
the current demand, I think we were saying this 10 years ago, and I think it's now even worse. But
yeah, I mean, especially when you throw in international fixtures, like, I mean, it's just, there's no way. I mean, the demand.
Exactly, yeah, the travel, and it's no longer a 10-month season. It's now a year-round season. So, and we weren't doing great. The manager was under a lot of pressure, and one of our performing midfielders at the time, he was required to play all the games through the sort of December period and the early January, and we were still in a cup competition as well, which meant not only did we play 2 days over Christmas, I think we played almost 2 days in 3 days first week of January as well. So it was a double blow. And at that time we were measuring HRV really well, in a systematic manner. Players were brought in, managers were brought in. It was great. And this player, we were at a real close view of how his nervous system and HRV, which again encapsulates the mental fatigue aspect, particularly when players are having stresses from outside of the physical demands, so mental stresses from social media, pressure of the team not performing,
and missing out on family events potentially that are happening during that like vacation 2-week block that everyone in the country is having.
Exactly. It all sort of feeds in,
and
and luckily the player, he got through nearly the majority of the fixtures, and then actually came down with an upper respiratory tract infection at the end, like a general sort of illness. But then what happened after that was, so he got through the nuts and bolts of it, but following that first week of January, he couldn't recover. He couldn't return to that homeostasis that we'd known anyway. His HRV was here normally.
Right.
We'd have peaks and troughs from
just well below his baseline.
After this massive stress, which incorporates this mental side, we were monitoring for another few months after that, where he was taken out of the team and his HRV hadn't even recovered. Wow. So it shows that nervous system, I think, in high-level stress situations, which includes physical and the mental component, you may be able to get through that initial real stress alarm phase, but I'd be worried about the lasting effects of that type of thing.
There's real damage, that's happening when you're not allowing your body to return back to baseline.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and again, we can always argue, well, whether it was it the muscle fatigue aspect, or was it the mental side, was it the pressure from external sources? But I think all of that together, I think HRV does give us a general indication from that sort of proxy of the autonomic nervous system.
I think that's why there's obviously, I'm drinking the Kool-Aid here, but just a lot of value in understanding what your baseline is, right? And when there are these events in your life that occur that creates a huge suppression and some of these metrics that we know are proxy for kind of, mental and physical like wellness, and if there are things that we can do to kind of strengthen our autonomic nervous system, for example, and get us back on track, I think that is a worthy path to really consider. And that maybe can lead us into, our next kind of discussion. I'd love to dig deep on recovery modalities. I think the thesis here at Whoop is, what we're really trying to do is help people have more control of their physiology, which, at its root, it's really having more control of your autonomic nervous system, right? And I think, the world will kind of be divided into two camps. There'll be those who have control of their physiology and those who don't. And I think it's about having tools, right? And really setting up a framework in your life to be able to, account for the things that are going to have the biggest impact on your autonomic health, right? And, sleep is one for sure. But I'd love to talk through just some of the other modalities that have the biggest impact on the autonomic nervous system and our HRV and hence just this overall kind of concept of recovery.
Fascinating area. But just on that last point about the HRV, I think that the key point that you made, which is amazing, is that these ranges of HRV that we probably need to understand certainly more about, but that's how we should look at HRV, and that every individual has their little lower and upper range.
Yeah.
And I think if they're within that gives an indication of normality, but also whether or not it's trending to positive or negative. And I think when we go out of those ranges, both from a positive and negative point of view, that's where we should maybe look into it a little bit more. But each individual can have those ranges up and down, that sort of HRV distribution. And that's not what we know. We don't know much about that and why, but certainly from the athletes that I've worked with, the very power-based, reactive, physical attributed players and athletes were very much more on the lower end. So that more reactive, the nervous system can turn on straight away, bang, and they're ready to go. So, and we saw a lot more of the endurance-based athletes. So we would always do some endurance capacity-based assessments.
Yep.
And guess what? All the high performers, particularly our centre midfielders who are these endurance-based athletes, they all had their ranges right at the top.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important. But anyway, back onto the recovery strategies. So
yeah, I definitely
huge area. I love this area because
there's a lot of confusion.
Oh, huge. Because So I think
just timing, frequency, temperature, cooling, heating.
Yeah.
So maybe start, Robin. I think because there's a lot of confusion, and I know you kind of believe in thinking of having frameworks, right? So maybe just start. So if we're looking at the literature, for example, and we're looking at all the literature around post-exercise cooling, for example, where I know you just published a paper on this, but when we're looking at kind of the data, like what's the first question do we ask? What's the second question do we ask? What's the third question we ask in terms of like effectiveness and like just what's the framework in your opinion on how people can kind of think about these modalities more broadly, and then we can kind of dig into each one?
I think we certainly need to think critically. So you asked like, well, what is the first step? Well, the first step is, well, what am I recovering from?
Mm-hmm. Good.
Like we've discussed, okay? So if we are, for example, if we've played a soccer match, you're going to be sore, structural damage. What we do know is from clinical work and just from years and years of research that we always use ice packs to cold an injury or cool an injury, or we use ice baths. So that's actually a pretty good place to start, because what cooling actually does in the event of this structural damage where the muscle fibers have had a mechanical stress put on them, we have this inflammatory cascade which cryotherapy and cooling can actually reduce the secondary phase of. So we know that actually happens. And so if we cool the skin, we cool the tissue, we can then probably reduce this secondary phase of the inflammatory infiltration. And we actually hope to, as well, reduce blood flow. And hopefully, in some cases, there is some work in other areas of reducing metabolism as well. So that's our first port of call. If we are in structural damage phase, we have soreness, we have a game like football or soccer, we want to cool the area because they're likely to have some structural damage. And then second phase, well, how do we do it? How do we cool? Well, we know there's whole body cryotherapy, which is really popular. Mm-hmm. We know there's cold tubs, ice baths. We know there's ice packs. There's phase change material, which are pretty much ice packs, which can keep regions cool for longer. And we certainly know that the idea is to cool for as long as possible. So then that makes me think about, well, you've got whole body cryotherapy and the chambers, which is air. We have cold water immersion and ice bath and ice tubs, which is liquid. And then the ice packs are solid. So we're actually thinking about physics now, and it's the law of thermodynamics. And we know that liquid is going to cool at a greater level and potency than not just air, but also solids as well. So our second phase, right, let's use cold baths and cold tubs, because we know we're going to get a better response. And we have literature around this as well. And as well, it's reasonably cheap. If you're a weekend warrior like we've discussed, running a cold bath at home, which is going to be around 20 to 22 degrees Celsius, which I don't know in Fahrenheit.
40-ish is fine.
There you go.
Would work, yeah.
It's
Anything
going to
below
do the
40,
job. It's going to do the job. And
Yeah.
making sure you're inactive afterwards is going to really help lower and drop that tissue temperature, which, again, is going to be the real aim in reducing that secondary damage phase following mechanical stress and subsequent structural damage.
If we're interested in adaptation, would you recommend the same protocol?
Well, so again, we have to think what adaptation. If you're looking to improve strength power type adaptation, so you're someone that's in the gym, you're lifting weights every day, or you're in a power or strength based sport, or even if you're in a team sport, which the phase of that training period is going to be strength and power, then we know that this cooling of this secondary sort of damage phase, that's going to reduce those adaptations, because that secondary damage phase is there to improve fitness. It's in there to create a cellular response to get fitter, get stronger.
People really have to understand their intent, right? Like, what are they actually trying to achieve with the workout, and how does that modality either help accelerate that or not, right? Like, I think that's a really important way to think
But the flip side is that very highly endurance-based training, cooling actually can, there's a gene expression, a cellular response where cooling can actually improve that.
Right.
So it can be confusing, but I think simplifying the process is understanding. Again, it sort of comes back to the first point of the podcast, where it's, well, do we even need to recover, and what are we even recovering from? So I think, if you're in a phase of you're trying to really get strong, resistance training, power training, I would avoid using cold baths. However, the other flip side is, what is the actual practical nature of that blunting adaptation? Because we know, there's a cellular blunting. We know we get a reduced cellular response. But what does that actually equate to in a performance? Is that even going to have a reduction in what you can lift or your power output? We still don't know that. But I think the safe side would be, if you're looking, and again, the take home is, if you're looking to improve strength, power, I would stay away from cooling muscle following that training stress and that damage response. And I think the flip side would be, we could maybe use heating, hot water immersion, or any form of sort of heating the tissue to maybe actually to get a greater response from that. So it's again, it's by no means a simple process, but I think if we sort of unlock and sort of unravel some of these components of what we're trying to do, I think we can start to get to whether we want to cool or potentially heat. And I think those temperature-based modalities are probably the most promising from a recovery point of view. Of course, sleep, nutrition, hydration, and for me, joint range of motion, maintenance, they're the kings, they're the fundamentals. But following that, like you mentioned at the start, there's so many recovery modalities and tools that we have on offer.
Right.
And I think really the temperature-based ones are probably the most promising. So I think it's about understanding when and how to use them is going to be a great tool for, again, not just athletes, but for the general population to have in their toolbox.
So if we think about it from kind of where we started, the origins of fatigue, right? The metabolic and structural. And I think too, like, we can consider just kind of cognitive and mental emotional fatigue, right? I think are real legitimate buckets that we should consider. Would you say that we can put modalities, kind of anything that increases circulation, for example, would probably fall into the metabolic, and manual therapy would kind of fall into the structural? Is that the right way to kind of think about these modalities? And if so, kind of how would you, if we talk about metabolic first, like, what would be the most efficacious ways at like addressing that origin of fatigue?
Yeah, certainly. I think that's completely the best way to go at it. I think we should have these buckets, and I think you're right. Right, what falls into structural damage and what falls into metabolic fatigue, and definitely metabolic fatigue, anything that's going to increase circulation, again, remove some of those metabolites and byproducts which are negative away from the area, is going to be helpful. If we can do that with low load or low mechanical load, then even better.
Like a zone.
And I think heating.
Zone 2 training would be
a way to
I think
anything
recovery.
off. I think anything off off feet as well. I mean,
Yeah.
I think
Like
if you're in a period where you've just potentially you have had a large day from an exercise perspective, and it is maybe, let's say it's running, then do we want to increase that circulation from running again the next day, where we could put some of those joints and some of those mechanical tissues under a bit more pressure? So cycling, but in that, you mentioned zone 2, in that type of heart rate percent range where we know we're not getting a big response metabolically,
yeah,
but we're increasing circulation. We're effectively pumping and using some of our muscles to pump around blood, and again, try and resynthesize those byproducts and metabolites. And I think heating can have that effect as well. So we know from heating the tissue, we do get a cellular response related to healing. But also, if you're, for example, if you have access to a hot tub or a jacuzzi, we know we have the pressure of the water, which can increase blood flow. We know we have the heat, which can do that even more so. And of course, if you can always cycle your legs in the water, so you have no mechanical load, you've taken away gravity, and again, you're sort of ticking every box. I think from a metabolic perspective, that's definitely something I would recommend. And again, we've discussed cooling from a structural damage phase. I think the really interesting parts of this is, where does all the manual therapy stuff and all the other things that are popping up here, there, and everywhere, where does that fit in the framework? And unfortunately, there's not much physiological evidence for those types of things, like massage, like any type of manual therapy.
I think there's a psychological component, though.
Exactly.
You know, and we've seen that.
And that's where, like, for me, it's never about taking anything away. And if an athlete loves having a massage, we all love having a massage, it feels great. But we just should acknowledge, well, we're not moving blood, we're not moving anything, but we are getting a good perceived effect, good psychological effect. So I think in the absence of times where we know we need to improve recovery, or our subcomponents of recovery from a physiological manner, whether it be cooling, heating, offloaded circulatory work, then I think that's when we say to athletes or the general population, right, do what makes you feel good within reason.
Recovery modalities, I think, to your point, like, if it feels good, it's probably going to have a positive effect. What you believe is happening has a super powerful effect on your physiology, right? And there's some good evidence to support that. So I think figuring out, as you think about these modalities, I think that's one way to think about it, because most of these are not going to really do harm for the most part, right? But there's a way, if we're talking about optimizing, for example, cold therapy, if we want to adapt, maybe shutting down or inhibiting mTOR response is not what we want to do, right? Like, so, we just have to be specific.
However, I'll jump in there and I'll say, well, if we have, let's go back to the example of, it's the Christmas period in the Premier League, and Man United have to play 26th and the 28th of December, and a player on the 27th, so the only day in between the games, he's playing both games. He only wants to do what makes him feel good, which is not necessarily what we know will improve his physiological recovery. Would that not be a bit of a detrimental process for that athlete for that next game?
For sure. I mean, those stakes are really high, and that's where the science needs to take over and prescribe.
And that's why I think it's really important that we have these buckets of, right, from a physiological perspective, this bucket, but I think we have a third, and that is that perceived belief effect, therapeutic, whatever we want to call it, bucket in which any recovery modality may go into, because it could be that some players actually really love to do cold water immersion. So again, in the absence of, well, the stakes aren't too high, as you put it, then let them do what they want, because like you mentioned, there's this athlete belief effect, or human belief effect, which we all love. We all are exposed to it. We all have it in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's someone believes a magnesium supplement is going to improve their sleep, whether it does or not, they believe it. And does that make them feel great? Probably. And there's probably an element of ignorance is bliss as well. So we do have to be mindful of that, and it's very powerful. And also there's this placebo phenomenon where actually there are transmitter changes within the brain during an intervention, or a modality, whether it's medical or recovery, that occurs. So we shouldn't think of a placebo effect as just, oh, well, I like to do it, so it has a placebo effect. The placebo effect is true. So I think that gets us into a little bit of trouble when we use the placebo effect as an excuse sometimes. Oh, well, I get the placebo effect. Well, just because you like it doesn't mean you are getting that positive effect, because we also know we get the nocebo effect, where we have a reduction in outcome. And one thing that is really interesting to me is we know we adapt to physical stress. So if the placebo effect is a psychophysiological phenomenon and occurrence, then if we're always doing things that support our placebo effect, then do we adapt to that? Because we know it's psychophysiological. Because we know we adapt to physiological and physical adaptation. So I think it's a really interesting discussion point, and I think it can go either way. So I think it's something that for me, I like to try and harness that belief effect. So if an athlete has a belief effect, well, let's try and sequence. We have these buckets of recovery strategies now: metabolic, structural damage, therapeutic, and the perceived athlete belief effect. How can we sequence these things in the best manner and framework to improve performance? And that's how I try and work with athletes now, and with teams now, or with just the general population now. How do we sequence these strategies and harness that belief effect in the right way to improve performance? Because it's understandable how it's human nature. If we have a game on a Saturday, or we do a half marathon on a Saturday, and then on the Sunday we get a massage, and then we sort of monitor how we feel Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and of course the body is great at naturally healing itself. So no wonder if we have that massage on the Sunday, our human nature is to attribute every improvement that was going to happen anyway to that massage. So it's human nature that we're going to want to try and fixate and really grab hold of things that's why that worked, because of that massage. So we have to think critically and sequence a lot of these things in the right manner. Because I believe, instead of having that massage on that Sunday, if you do cold water on the Sunday, Monday, hot water on the Wednesday, massage on the Thursday, you would have accelerated your recovery way more, and that also recovery curve has probably shifted to the left, and you're back to homeostasis way sooner than you would have been by just having that generic recovery strategy on that Sunday.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think in terms of just putting too much weight on one thing, just like you shouldn't put too much weight on physical exertion impacting next day recovery, like folks have to remember that it's just sequencing and timing of these modalities is really important. But it's, if we're really thinking about, okay, how do I actually show up tomorrow with as much capacity as possible? It's nutrition, it's hydration, it's sleep, it's, those are recovery modalities too, and we need to kind of think about them in those terms, and obviously these are lifestyle kind of behavioral things, but the more of these boxes we can check, the cleaner we eat, the more hydrated we are, the better sleep and consistent sleep that we get, and then layering in some of these recovery modalities we're talking about are going to kind of add up to really position you tomorrow to be at, whatever would be your potential for that day, give you the best chance of reaching your potential for that day.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you mentioned there that sleep, nutrition, hydration, and for me, I'm trying to put this out as much as I can, like just maintain joint range of motion. Yeah, so if sleep is more important, then what we do know as well from a cooling perspective, and how cooling can also affect the nervous system, is that when we cool, we actually improve that parasympathetic reactivation, which we can see in high HRV values. So if we are monitoring our recovery using HRV, we know that cold water immersion, not only will it improve our secondary damage phase following structural damage and mechanical stress, but it can also improve our autonomic nervous system in the way of parasympathetic reactivation. So that's something that's also been seen with improvements of sleep. So not only are we improving the nervous system in a certain manner, but we're seeing an indirect positive impact on sleep. So can cooling or cold water immersion in the best form, in my opinion, can that be used as a indirect way of improving sleep? I think probably yes.
Yeah.
However, the timing of that's probably going to be really important, because we also know that as we fall asleep, our body cools. And I think the sort of natural, intuitive thought process of, well, let's cool before bed. Well, we actually know that hot water immersion or a hot bath or a hot shower before bed stimulates this cooling effect of the body,
Right.
following the
Vasodilation.
exposure.
Yeah. All the
Exactly,
blood
yeah.
rushes to the
So,
extremities. Yeah.
yeah, so now if we talk about improving sleep through means of recovery strategies, then maybe a cold water immersion exposure or a cold tub in the day, followed by a hot bath or a hot shower in the hour prior to bed, could be a really good tool and a really good strategy for us all to use to improve sleep. So I think there's definitely ways that we can use these recovery strategies to try and bolster and boost some of these fundamental recovery components that we know is so important. Because I think if you don't show appreciation to sleep, adequate nutrition, including carbohydrate, protein consumption, hydration, and also joint range of motion, I think a lot of the other stuff we're really going to be struggling to see a practical performance improvement in our daily lives, or whether it comes to recovery or returning to homeostasis and then being able to perform in the subsequent days or weeks following. So I think that's a really important point. And again, we all know that things like alcohol as well can have such a sensitive impact to our HRV levels. But I know this is something we've discussed in the past. Is it that alcohol is very sensitive to HRV, or is it that alcohol is actually really sensitive to our recovery? Because I think potentially there could be an offset in power between those two associations or those two relationships. So I think that's also something that I think when we do monitor our recovery from a HRV perspective, that we should understand that alcohol has a very, very sensitive effect to HRV levels. And that maybe doesn't necessarily have that direct and that same power to overall recovery.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely see that in our data. At a population level, like alcohol is just like absolutely crushing to next day recovery.
Yeah. But again, it's brilliant though, because that it just boils down to thinking very critically about some of these measures. And we know that there's a physiological change.
Right.
But what is the practical importance of that change? What is the practical importance of that HRV being dropped a little bit? Because it may be in some circumstances, yes, well, maybe the next day, let's ease off it. Let's use some of these recovery modalities that we can use that we know can maybe stimulate HRV, like cooling. Mm-hmm. But let's not maybe throw the baby out with the bathwater and assume, really the HRV is very sensitive to alcohol in this circumstance. It's lowered, but really my recovery or my ability to train again or do X, Y, Z still is maintained to a certain extent. But again, it's a very tricky and it's a very deep area which probably needs a little bit more work on.
I love thinking about like the autonomic nervous system more as like a muscle that you can kind of train. And I think that's, just the last 10 years or so, I feel like it's becoming, people I think now are like, all right, this is actually, we can improve our autonomic control, by engaging in certain types of modalities, for example. And we've obviously been talking about a few that, stimulate the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system, which is going to help promote recovery. Other ones I just wanted to talk about real quick, yoga nidra and resonance frequency breathing are two that have really emerged. I think when you look at, if you do kind of a meta-analysis of all the literature that exists, like these kind of bubble up to the surface as being really efficacious and promoting, increasing HRV. So really just two that actually mediate heart rate variability. And there's very few things that we can point to in the literature that we can say actually improve HRV, and these are two that can. What are your kind of thoughts on just, I guess, breath work in general? And then, what are your thoughts specifically around yoga nidra and resonance frequency breathing?
I think going back to one of those points you made was, can we try and find methods or tools which can improve some of our autonomic nervous system components? And again, we've seen that cold water immersion and cooling does have that effect, and also certain breathing techniques as well. And I think it's quite intuitive that we know that sort of the respiratory system and ventilation does have a direct effect on some of our HRV components and the infrastructure of that. So it makes complete sense. I think from my perspective, I think it's certainly something that I think it boils down to, it's the same with cooling. So we know that these methods can improve our HRV. We know we can get into a nervous system phase from our, again, an indirect measure, HRV, where it's assumed that we're in a more restorative state. So that is intuitively a positive thing, but what is the practical difference, or what is the actual, how does that affect our life, or how does that really affect what we do next? So that's, I think, the next stage, because we know that, yes, cooling, breathing techniques definitely have this effect on HRV and the nervous system, but we don't yet know really what that has effect from a practical point of view. So I think that's the next phase. I think that's where some research should sort of go deeper into. Well, yeah, okay, we have a tool from breathing techniques or from cooling that improves HRV. So, well, what is the physical performance related from that? Do we see an improvement if we then start to measure and monitor that and research that? So I think that's the next phase, because again, like you said, there are some tools we can use, but for me, I think when we try and advocate using them with athletes, for example, we need a real solid evidence and rationale this is going to really improve, because I think particularly from a breathing technique perspective, if you have a squad or a team of footballers or soccer players, how would you really get them to do that? I think there's certainly, you only have a certain amount of time to try and impose or recommend or train them in certain ways. I try and think back to, I took a recovery session the day after a game for nearly 10 years. And so I always think, well, how could I try and incorporate some of these things into that type of session? I think there's probably some ways where it may be I would always do some lower back mobility type work, because again, joint range of motion, one of my sort of fundamentals.
Yeah, it's in my top 6, mobility.
Game. Exactly. And I think we've got to be careful with stretching other areas because there may be some structural damage. But in that type of mobility time and focus, could we incorporate some breathing technique work or similar to then also get more bang for our buck? Well, we're in this state, let's try and improve that sort of HRV or that nervous system response. I think in those circumstances, I think it would be really valuable, because I think standalone, it's probably something that athletes or the general population would do in isolation rather than within a team environment. But I think if we can incorporate that as a team in some way, shape or form, I think if you've got, again, those buckets and those areas you want to check from a recovery component point of view, if you can tick the mobility, joint range of motion with, well, we're doing a little bit of work to enhance our restorative state through HRV, then I think you're doing really well.
I think you make a really important point that there's only so much time in the day, and you have to prioritize, which modalities are folks going to do. And I think most importantly, being able to lean on the literature to say, okay, these are actually the most efficacious at mediating heart rate variability, right? And I think that's one of the pain points of folks on the Whoop platform, is they're like, well, how do I actually improve my recovery, right? Like if I want to, peak over the next few days, like what are the boxes that I need to actually check? And mobility is a massive one, right? Making sure that you're staying hydrated and avoiding alcohol. I think eating inside a specific window of time, restricting your feeding window is another, I think, really important. I mean, I think about that as recovery, right? I know that if I do that, it's going to enhance tomorrow's recovery, and there's a nice downstream effect to having a specific feeding window as it relates to kind of your circadian rhythm. And then I think HRV biofeedback is one of the best ways, it's not, when you think about meditation, mindfulness, those modalities are awesome, and I don't want to diminish them, but they're hard for people. And I think they're hard for elite athletes specifically, from just my experience, my personal experience, and then just, working with elite athletes as well. Like I find that that's a harder modality to grasp onto. But when you give them something like resonance frequency breathing, which is an HRV biofeedback technique, all of a sudden now athletes are, all right, I'm following a pacer and it's based, I'm trying to map my heart rate with my respiratory rate and I can kind of see it happening in real time. And I think that getting the buy-in there is like, okay, this is the one, modality that we know has been proven to actually improve your heart rate variability, right? Like we'll see a parasympathetic effect after this session that is, really obvious, and that leads to less anxiety. It has all sorts of like positive effects.
That's certainly the point, Kristen, as well, where I think we shouldn't probably forget that HRV is this indirect measure, and we shouldn't. Yeah. I think maybe we should be careful. We're not chasing HRV numbers. It's going to give us that indication of this is going to give us, in probability, the best chance of X, Y, Z. Like you say, reduced anxiety, better sleep. But I think we need to make sure the next level is, we've chased that HRV number, or we've got to that point. We know that breathing or this cold water does improve it. Well, what is that relationship to performance in a sporting context, or a better quality of life for the general population with, like you said, reduced anxiety, mental health, all that type of thing. So I think that's definitely the exciting point in time that we're at. And I think you also mentioned it perfectly. I think with any strategy, it's prioritization. What do we prioritize at any given time? And going back to the football and soccer and the athletes I work with now, it's at any given time point, whether it's in the week or the year or the day, that be critical and understand what is your limiting fatiguing factor. And that's what we termed it was, at this time point, what is the most important thing we need to prioritize to make sure we get to a certain level in an hour, whether it's getting ready to train. The next day, we've got a match, getting ready to perform. They're the things that we need to try and be really critical of and understand, right, what is the priority? Because like we say, we've got these buckets now, we have our athlete belief, we have our tools as well we can use to improve these indirect measures of rest and the restorative state. So, right, put that all into this framework and understand what is our limiting fatiguing factor, and then I think we're way ahead of the majority in terms of improving performance, recovery, and lifestyle.
And controlling our physiology.
Exactly.
Which is the end state, yeah. This has been a super fun discussion. Is there anything that we kind of left out that you feel like is really important related to recovery that folks who listen to this podcast should know?
I think the thing we don't know a lot about yet is a lot of the percussion tools which maybe you refer to as like massage guns or those types of things. We don't really know much about them yet. I think
the Hypervolt and I think
just being critical of what they're actually doing. I think they've been termed massage guns, but are they really doing that? Well, I hope not, because we know from a sort of evidence perspective that may not be doing a lot, but I think from a vibration point of view, which I think is actually what they're doing, I think there could be some promising research to be conducted. But I think I think being aware and being quite critical of what's out there and what actually things do, and really understanding whether or not it does work. But when we think about the word work, what works? Does this thing work? Try and understand that recovery is those sort of subcomponents of the stresses that we go through. And I think that's one of my sort of key take-home messages. And it's not just for elite athletes or sporting teams or organisations. I think we're in a day and age now where wellness, everyone wants to feel great every day. So maximising some of these things, I think it's only going to get bigger. And I think the future of this recovery space and the science of recovery is massive, and I think it's really exciting. So, and I think using and having products like Whoop and being able to understand a little bit more about our physiology, our sort of biometrics is definitely helping people understand more and being educated about this area.
Driving the right behaviors. You start to figure out, okay, how, what works for me, and am I trending in the right direction, and there's really no need to guess anymore, just given the fidelity of the, of Whoop and, the quality of the data. I think it really gives us just a nice understanding of, how our body is responding and adapting, and therefore a nice picture of a general capacity level, Where can people find you to follow your work?
All the usual places.
LinkedIn, Instagram.
Yeah, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. I'm Dr. Robin Thorpe or Dr. Robin Thorpe. Send me a message or
Perfect.
or a tweet, whatever it may be, and I'll definitely enjoy a conversation around this area. And again, I want to learn more, and I want to drive, hopefully as well, drive that community and that industry in the right way. And like I said, I think there's so much more to be done in this space, whether it's monitoring and those biometric factors, or whether it's managing and improving and accelerating recovery. I think it's hugely exciting for everyone involved. So yeah, please reach out, and I will. I can't promise I'll be that quick in responding, but I always make sure I respond.
And we will be doing some research together in 2022, so I'm excited about that. Yeah.
Definitely, I'm excited to continue the journey.
Yeah, me too. Well, thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Great, thanks, Kristen.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. Make sure to subscribe to the Whoop Podcast. Check us out on social at Whoop and at Will Ahmed. And you can get 15% off a Whoop membership if you use the code WILL, WILL. That's all for now, folks. We'll see you next week. Stay healthy and stay in the green.